In this video, we'll create our ship upgrade mechanics as well as adding the mechanics for our player point and alternate fire charging value and display modifiers. In the link in the description, you'll find a link to freely download the assets and scripts or macro we created in this video. Feel free to download them and follow along, dissect the macro, or to simply use the completed effect in your game or project. Let's begin by creating our upgrade and alternate charge sprite. To do this, we'll simply place the sprite in our scene, scale it to the appropriate size, then add a spherical collider, and check the Is Trigger checkbox. Before we begin, let's go over the mechanics we want to put in place. To score points, our player must destroy asteroids and enemies. We also want our player to be able to upgrade their ship or get additional laser beam charges by scoring a set number of these points, at which point the upgrade or alternate fire charging sprite will appear and the player must try to get it while avoiding enemies or asteroids. Once complete, let's add a flow graph to the game object we'll be using for alternate charge prefab. Instead of creating and saving a macro, let's use an embedded graph. To do this, we need to click the source dropdown on our flow machine component, and instead of macro, select embedded. To begin this graph, we want to use an onTriggerEnter event. We want to then use a branch node in conjunction with a GameObjectCompareTag node, and use our player tag for its tag string input. Since the onTriggerEnter node outputs a collider, we'll need to use a component getGameObject node, and use the output as the input of our GameObjectCompareTag node. Lastly, if our branch node is true, we want to send a custom event called addCharge to our game manager. To do this, we'll first need to create a scene graph variable for our game manager. We want to make it a game object type and place our game manager as its value, and use our game manager scene variable for our target game object input. After our custom trigger node, we'll need to add a game object destroy node, and we'll use self as the target input object. We'll next need to add a set of nodes to handle our alternate charges movement. For this, we'll use a doMoveY node and connect it to our start state event. We'll set our end value as -6, and let's also create a graph float variable which we'll call speed, and use the speed variable as its duration. For the moment, let's set the value to 3. Let's then add a wait for seconds node and use our speed variable as the delay time. Lastly, let's use another game object destroy node, and we'll again use self as the target input object. With that complete, let's now copy our flow machine component and paste it on our upgrade game object. For our new graph, we'll simply change the name of the custom event to addUpgrade. Let's now rename our game objects and make them into prefabs. However, for testing purposes, we'll temporarily leave them in our scene. Before we begin creating our upgrade and alternate charge mechanics, let's first create a spawn point for our upgrade and our alternate charge sprite. We'll place them at the top of our scene and outside the range of the camera. With that complete, let's now go into our game manager graph and begin creating our functionality. We'll start by creating 2 transform variables, one for each spawn point. Then place the newly created game object transforms as their values. Next, let's create 3 integer variables which we'll call asteroid point value, upgrade point value, and last upgrade score. And 3 float variables we'll call points for upgrade, points for alternate charge, and we'll name the final float point multiplier. Let's start by copying the nodes from our score display text and alternate charge display text from the start state of our AG game super state, and let's then paste them in our playing state. Let's first change our set score custom event to display score and remove our custom event trigger after our text set text node. Let's also change the name of our set all charges custom event to display charge, and then remove its custom event trigger after our set text node. Let's begin by creating a custom event node, and we'll name it add charge. We'll use that to trigger our set alternate fire charges scene variable node, and for our input value we want to add 1 to the alternate fire charges variable. We then want to create a custom event trigger node to trigger our display charges custom event. Let's test our functionality so far. To do this, we'll need to be sure to put our upgrade and alternate fire sprites within our AG game object. This way they'll be deactivated and won't destroy themselves while we're in the main menu. We can see now, once we got our charge sprite, that our charge display increased to 3, and our charge flow in our scene variable is now 3 as well. Additionally, our charge sprite is no longer in our scene since it's set to destroy itself when it collides with the player. Before we continue, within our prefabs, let's change the speed of our alternate charge sprite object as well as our upgrade sprite object to 2, and let's change their do move y in value to -8. Let's now go back into our playing state and add our ship upgrading functionality. So let's begin with our add upgrade custom event, which is a custom event that our upgrade sprite object is sending right before it's destroyed. Since we'll be destroying our base ship and spawning our upgraded ship in its same location, we'll need to create a vector3 variable and set it with the location of our spaceship before we destroy that game object. So after creating our variable in our graph, let's create a set variable node and use the transform position of our scene variable spaceship object as its input. Keep in mind, within our ship's graph, we set it to make itself our scene variable spaceship object's variable value. With our ship's position stored, let's then create a game object destroy node, and for our input we'll use the value of our scene variable spaceship object. From there, let's create a game object instantiate node, and the object we want to instantiate is our scene variable ship upgrade prefab. For our position, we'll use the vector3 value we stored of the spaceship object we just destroyed, and for our rotation we can simply use a quaternion literal node and leave it at 0. Since our ship's graph is set to store all the objects tagged laser spawn point, let's create a wait node after our game object destroy node and before our game object instantiate node. This way we can be sure that our new updated ship doesn't try to store any of the laser spawn points of our base ship before the game object is destroyed. It will also allow us to place a visual effect symbolizing our ship is being upgraded. And we'll need to be sure to change our custom event into a coroutine. And after our game object instantiate node, let's also activate our upgrade display object, as well as setting our is upgraded scene variable to true. Before we continue, let's create a sprite effect and animation that we can use for our ship upgrade. With our upgrade sprite effect complete, let's make a scene variable for our new prefab and place it as its value. With our variable created, we want to instantiate our sprite right after we destroyed our ship scene variable and before our wait node. For our position, we'll use the same position that we're using to instantiate our new upgraded ship. Lastly, let's create another object variable, which we'll simply use to store our instantiated upgraded ship effect, so we can destroy it once our ship is instantiated. Lastly, we want our player to get a point bonus and an extra charge once they've upgraded their ship. To do this, we're going to use a set variable node to set the player's score variable. Then we'll add the current score by the upgrade value. So let's place 50 into our upgrade value. We'll use our custom event trigger to trigger our add charge custom event. And lastly, the display score custom event trigger. With the basics of our ship upgrade and scoring system now complete, we'll begin adding our asteroids to our game, along with our explosion effect and asteroid destruction effect.
Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to be the first to see this and many other tutorials, game development tips, and free game asset giveaways.